In this module, we'll discuss principles of cookery as they pertain to specifically meat items. The objectives for this module are: describe the structure and composition of meats, explain meat inspection and grading practices, purchase appropriate meats, store meats properly, prepare meats for cooking, and apply various dry heat, moist heat, and combination cooking methods to meat. So what is meat? Meat refers to beef, veal, lamb, pork, and poultry. Sometimes even seafood is thrown into this mixture. Meat often consumes the largest portion of the food purchasing dollar. We'll discuss how to protect your investment later in the class. So let's discuss muscle composition. Muscle tissues give meat its characteristic appearance. The amount of connective tissue, such as sinew and what we refer to many times as gristle, determines the meat's tenderness. Muscle tissue is approximately 72% water, 20% protein, 7% fat, and 1% minerals. And proper cooking techniques will eliminate or reduce the shrinkage involved with meat. Some shrinkage is going to be expected in the loss of water weight, but we want to try and reduce that as much as possible. A single muscle is composed of bundles of muscle cells or fibers and connective tissues. As you can see from the diagram, each muscle section is independent of each other. They're grouped into large muscle segments, and within those you have connective material or fatty deposits that surround them. Meat's texture is determined by the thickness of the cells, the size of the cell bundles, size of connective tissue. And speaking of muscles and fat in particular, let's talk about marbling. Marbling is when an animal fattens some water and proteins in lean muscle tissues turn to fat. Marbling refers to this whitish streaks of inter and intramuscular fat. Interfat is going to be intermuscular is within the muscle, intramuscular is outside of the muscle. Adds tenderness and flavor to cooked meats. And its principal factor in determining the meat quality. The amount of intermuscular fat, or marbling as we call it, is going to determine the grade of the beef, being either select, choice, or prime. Connective tissue in meat forms the walls of long muscle cells, primarily in frequently used muscles. These include things such as tendons and ligaments, which are consistent of either collagen or elastin. And when cooked with moist heat, they contract and break down into water and gelatin. The meat of older animals are more resistant to breaking down, so we used moist heat cooking methods in this process. A single muscle is composed of many bundles of muscle cells or fibers held together by connective tissues. The thickness of the muscle cells, the size of the cell bundles, and the connective tissues holding them together form the grain of the meat and determines the meat's texture. All meats are inspected by the USDA. The USDA inspection stamp for whole carcasses is on the left, and USDA inspection stamp for fabricated meats is on the right. Meat is inspected for wholesomeness and fit for human consumption. The USDA also grades for quality. Beef is graded by USDA Prime, Choice, Select, Commercial, Utility, Cutter, and Canner. While typically we will see Prime, Choice, and Select at the grocery store, you will probably never see Commercial, Utility, Cutter, or Canner because these are used in commercial applications such as meat products, and in the case of the lower end, the Canner, you'll see this in more animal food. Veal is rated USDA Prime, Choice, Good, Standard, and Utility. with prime, choice, and good being the main ones. Lamb, USDA prime, choice, and good, and then utility. And pork is rated USDA number 1, number 2, number 3, and utility. The most common we'll see is number 1 and number 2. One of the common misconceptions is that we can just slaughter an animal and then throw it on the grill. It doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, there's some biological processes that have to occur first. Muscles contract and stiffen in a process called rigor mortis, and this occurs within 6 to 24 hours of slaughtering process. If we don't allow it to go through this process, the meat will be tough and unedible. This allows us to age the meat or rest the meat. There are two different ways of resting or aging this meat. The first way is called wet aging, which means that it's stored in a vacuum packaging. This is the most common way that meat is aged in the United States. It is the kind of meat that you'll find in the grocery store in many cases. Dry aging is more of a process, and this is storing it in temperature and humidity controlled environments over a period of time. Now, while this doesn't look very pleasing to the eye, what this does is actually eliminate some of the moisture out of the product, and this darker surface area is cut away. And again, also that contributes to the high cost of this, because cutting away the outside, you're going to lose some weight to it, which makes it more expensive per pound. Also, it's going to concentrate the flavors. It's going to be much more flavorful. When purchasing meat, there are a couple of terminology terms that we need to be aware of. Specifications. Specifications refer to the size, quality, quantity of the product itself. IMPS, or Institutional Meat Purchase Specifications, is what we go by with this. Some of the terminology may be beef rib, roast ready. Well, that's a lot to be able to say, so we may shorthand this, and what we do is we use a NAMP, National Association of Meat Purveyors, Meat Buyer's Guide. And the Meat Buyer's Guide will give us a shorthand for this. Instead of saying beef rib roast ready, we simply say a 109. So it will give us a shorthand number for this particular thing. You can find this Meat Buyer's Guide at thelivestockinstitute.org, and it is a PDF which is downloadable. Portion control, or PC, is ready to cook and serve foods. So this would be an example of a PC steak. Instead of buying a whole rib roast, we want to buy individual rib eyes. Additional terminology include grass finished or grass fed. This beef comes from cattle that spend their whole life eating grass or forage. May also eat grass, forage, hay, or silage at the feed yard. May or may not have been given FDA-approved antibiotics to treat, prevent, or control disease and or growth-promoting hormones. Grain finished. Most beef is raised this way and likely doesn't have a specific label claim. This beef comes from cattle that spend the majority of their lives eating grass or forage, spend 4 to 6 months at a feed yard eating a balanced diet of grains, local feed ingredients like potato hulls or sugar beets, and hay or forage. May or may not be given U.S. Food and Drug Administration approval antibiotics to treat, prevent, or control disease and or growth promoting hormones. Certified organic. This beef comes from cattle that never receive any antibiotics or growth promoting hormones, may be either grain or grass finished as long as the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service certifies the feed is 100% organically grown, and may spend time at a feed yard. Naturally raised, which may refer to as never ever. This beef comes from cattle that never receive any antibiotics or growth promoting hormones, may be either grain or grass finished, may spend time at a feed yard. When storing meat, there are special provisions that have to be taken into consideration. Meat is highly perishable and is a potentially hazardous food. We want to store at temperatures between 30 degrees Fahrenheit and 35 degrees Fahrenheit in the coldest parts of your refrigeration units. When freezing, do so rapidly to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit if possible. This is accomplished by using a blast chiller or by reducing the amount of that you're putting in at one given time to make sure that it's freezing in smaller portions so it'll freeze much quicker. Use moisture and vapor-proof packaging to prevent freezer burn. And you want to avoid freezer burn at all costs. Freezer burn will give the meat a terrible taste and it will give it an off color or off look to it. There are 3 specific ways that we can prepare the meat for cooking. First is trussing and tying. This is to create a uniform shape for the meat so that it cooks more evenly. It can also be used if you have a piece of meat that's stuffed to prevent the stuffing from falling out. Barding is that adding an additional layer of fat to the outside of meat, such as wrapping a beef tenderloin in bacon. Larding is inserting small strips of fat into the meat, as shown in the picture to the right.
What I'm doing here is I'm making a slip knot. And that's the first thing that I'm doing with the string. To create the slip knot, I'm holding it in my right hand because I'm right-handed. I'm making a loop away from myself with the other string, pulling the small end in close, and then I'm making sure that I secure that slip knot. Then to secure the slip knot, because the slip knot will slip, I have to make another knot. And I make a loop and pull the small end in through the loop, creating a tied string that secures the knot.
Most cuts of meat, particularly those in animals that are four-legged, will be more tender in the center portion of the animal. Because of that, we tend to use dry heat cooking methods for those. We have to use very high quality tender cuts of meat for dry heat cooking methods, some of which include broiling and grilling, roasting, barbecuing. This is generally for tougher cuts of meat. We're talking about southern barbecuing, not northern barbecuing. Sauteing, pan frying, and deep frying. Determining degrees of doneness, particularly for a steak, is one of the most difficult things that a cook can learn how to do. Aside from temperatures, doneness is often categorized by description. Rare is described as a cool red center. Medium rare is a warm red center. Medium is a hot pink center. Medium well has a hot pinkish gray center. And well done has a hot gray center. And you can see their corresponding temperatures on the picture on the right hand side. When cooking meats, there are some other considerations that we have to take in, such as carryover cooking and resting roasted meats. Carryover cooking is cooking that doesn't stop the moment that it's removed from the oven. It continues to cook inward through conduction. So as it continues to heat, the inside will continue to get hotter and the outside will lose a little of its heat, causing an equilibrium between the two. If you cut into a steak immediately after taking it off the grill, first thing that's going to happen is the juices are going to run out of it, making it a little more dry. And the center will typically be a little cooler than it should be. Letting a steak sit for 10 minutes or 5 minutes will allow it to redistribute the juices and also allow the cooking process to finish. This is why I don't recommend taking chicken off the grill when it's 165 degrees, because it's going to continue to carry over cook and become tougher. Take it off at 160 degrees and allow it to rest for a few minutes. Resting allows these juices to redistribute themselves evenly through the roast or the chicken. This allows it to have a much more juicy piece of meat as opposed to a dry piece of meat. Carving is the process where roasts are always carved against the grain. This is slicing thin slices. We want to carve against the grain or across the grain to shorten that grain of muscle, that long strand of muscle, If we try to chew a long strand of muscle, it's going to be like chewing, well, shoestrings. We want to cut those shoestrings into smaller pieces so that it will chew much easily. Moist heat cooking methods are used for tougher cuts of meat, such as those that are closer to the head and to the hooves. These are used quite often to tenderize tough cuts of meat, so examples of that would be simmering. Combination cooking methods include both dry and moist heat methods, and they include braising and stewing. So for instance, this pot roast, when we braise this pot roast, we're going to sear it first, that's the dry heat method, and then we're going to submerge it halfway with liquid, that's the moist heat method. There's lots of different terms for stewing: ragu, fricassee, navarine, blanquette, chili con carne, goulash, tangine, adobo, and one I forgot to put on there, paprikash. Sous vide cooking is ideal for tough cuts of meat because it allows it to tenderize in its own liquids without wasting any additional liquids or incorporating water into it. This is a low temperature, moist heat cooking method, but it's under vacuum, so the food is actually away from the water source, although it's surrounded by water. It resembles poaching and braising. A vacuum sealed food is in plastic pouches. We cook it in precisely regulated hot water baths below simmering. Typically what we use is an immersion circulator. As you can see in the picture, it's small. The original ones of these were quite bulky and cost a lot. Now you can buy them for as low as $60. What it does is it literally heats the water and circulates the water at the same time, keeping the water hot throughout. Foods may be browned after cooking. Obviously, sous vide is not going to provide the browning that we like to see. So what we do many times is you can either brown it prior or you can brown it after. If you want crispiness, I highly recommend browning it after as opposed to prior. Food safety of utmost concern when sous vide. Local food regulations may require training, licensing, and record keeping. Food cooked sous vide are highly susceptible to bacterial contamination. To ensure food safety, follow the temperatures and cook times exactly. So some of the takeaways from this particular module: muscle tissues give meat its characteristic appearance. Fat content, connective material, and intermuscular marbling all play a role. The amount of marbling is often determined by the breed and the feed. The closer to the head and the hoof, the tougher the cuts of meat. Beef is graded either prime, choice, or select. All other grades below that are commercial use only and not for retail consumption. The way I remember this is prime is, well, prime. If we can't get prime, we choose choice, and if we can't get choice, we have to select. Dry aging reduces the moisture content, tenderizes, and intensifies the flavor. And cooking method to use depends on the tenderness of the meat.